After 3 years working unpaid for her families, you realize you were just a pawn. He gave them everything, his time, his talent, his loyalty. For 3 years he worked without a paycheck, building a company he thought was his future. But when the truth surfaced, it hit harder than betrayal. It exposed the illusion he'd been living in. This is the raw, reflective story of a man who believed love meant sacrifice, until he realized he was just a pawn in someone else's game. They looked at you like a stranger, and that was the moment you knew it was never love. It was leverage. You stood there just outside the glass doors of the office you once entered with a heart full of hope. The same office where you spent over 1,000 days and nights, building someone else's empire with nothing more than a quiet belief that love would one day recognize effort. But today, you walked out with a folder, not of memories, but of documents, emails, contracts, screenshots, signatures that weren't yours, but carried your work, your sweat, your name. Inside, they were still frozen, her father blinking, her brother whispering to someone on the phone, and she didn't even follow you. You waited for 1 second, maybe 2, nothing. No one called your name, so you smiled. Not a bitter smile, just a tired one. The kind of smile people wear when they finally wake up after a very long dream. You turned away, footsteps echoing on the concrete, and the wind that brushed your face felt honest. You had just left behind 3 years of your life. 3 years of unpaid work, of invisible sacrifice, of Sunday dinners filled with polite manipulation. You weren't angry, not yet, because even in that moment a part of you still whispered, maybe they didn't mean to use me. But truth doesn't need noise. It just needs clarity. And for the first time you saw things clearly. They didn't use you because they were cruel. They used you because they could. Because you let them. Because you believed that love meant loyalty. And they knew that. They knew you would stay. That you wouldn't ask for a contract. That you'd never demand what was rightfully yours. But you did demand something finally. Not with shouts. Not with tears. But with silence sharpened by proof. And now you're no longer part of their plan. You're a threat. Because the pawn learned to walk off the board. You might be wondering, how did it get here? Why would someone give so much only to become disposable? Let's go back, not to blame, but to understand. Because maybe, just maybe, you see yourself in this story. And maybe, just maybe, you need to know how it began, so you'll never let it happen to you. It started with Sunday dinners, warm smiles, and the illusion of family. It always starts soft. You were in love, genuinely. She wasn't just beautiful. She was driven, kind, and spoke about the future with the kind of certainty that made you believe she saw you in it. The two of you talked about dreams, about building something together. Not just a relationship, but a legacy. Then came the family. Her father stern but respectable. Her mother gracious with a voice like honeyed tea. And the brother, charming in public, dismissive in private. But in those early days you didn't see it. Or maybe you chose not to. One Sunday dinner, just as you were helping clear the plates, her father leaned in and said, "You know, someone like you could do real good with us. We're expanding. And family businesses, well, they need trustworthy hands." The compliment disarmed you. It felt like trust. It felt like inclusion. It felt like love with a job title. So you said yes. You left your job, decent salary, clear boundaries, a future of your own. And you stepped into theirs. Not as an employee, not even as a partner, but as the guy dating our daughter. That was the title on your nameplate, unspoken but ever present. The first few weeks you worked like a man in love, showing up early, staying late, doing things no one asked for. Because you believed in building something together. You thought this was the foundation for a life built on mutual effort. There was no talk of salary, no formal agreement, just trust, just smiles, just dinners where they clinked glasses and said things like, "We're so lucky to have you." And that right there was the illusion. They didn't hire you, they absorbed you. You didn't become a partner, you became a utility. But in the beginning it all looked like love. You ignored the little signs. The times you weren't included in strategic meetings. The way your ideas were rephrased in front of clients. The chuckles when someone said, "He's not blood, but he acts like he is." You laughed with them because you thought they meant it as affection. But deep down, a small voice inside whispered, "Careful. You're investing everything in a home that isn't yours." And you silenced that voice because love you thought meant trust, meant patience, meant sacrifice. You didn't know that sometimes sacrifice isn't noble. Sometimes it's how people test the limits of how little they can give you and how much you'll keep offering. You were dependable. That made you disposable. At some point, you stopped checking the clock. You no longer noticed when weekends came or when your phone buzzed during dinner because your life had folded into theirs. The company became your world, not by contract, not by choice, but by silent conditioning. You handled everything: sales, client, management, internal logistics. You fixed mistakes no one saw, covered gaps no one thanked you for. When her brother disappeared for days, you stepped in. When deadlines crashed, you stayed up all night. And each time you pulled them out of the fire, the praise was muted. A nod, a vague good work. Then they moved on, not even realizing that they had let you burn for them. Your friends started asking questions. Are you actually getting paid? Why is everything under their name? Dude, do you even have a contract? You laughed it off. Told them it was just temporary. That love takes time. That family takes trust. But deep inside, you felt the shift. You weren't building a future, you were being absorbed into one that wasn't yours. Her father began introducing you to clients as someone who helps us. Not by name, not by role, just helps. Her brother once joked in front of investors, "He's practically furniture now." Everyone laughed, even her. And you forced a smile, wondering, when did I stop being a person and start being a resource? The worst part, you made excuses for them. You defended them when others raised doubts. Because admitting the truth felt like betrayal, not of them, but of yourself, of the version of you that believed this was all worth it. You thought loyalty would earn you security, but loyalty in the wrong hands is just quiet captivity. There was no room for you to grow, no plans with your name on them, only silent expectations that you'd keep showing up, keep giving more, keep being useful. And you did, until one day, a client asked you privately, "Why aren't you running your own thing? You're clearly the mind behind this." That question stayed with you, long after the meeting, long into the night, because for the first time, you let it land. Maybe you weren't being loyal. Maybe you were just scared of what would happen if you stopped. But deep down, you knew the chains weren't around your wrists. They were in your heart, and they were made of trust you gave too freely for too long. Silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. There wasn't one big moment, no explosive fight, no screaming confrontation, just a slow erosion. The kind you don't notice at first, until one day you wake up and realize you're not a partner. You're not even respected, you're tolerated. It started when her brother took credit for a client pitch you had crafted from scratch. He didn't even blink, just delivered your words like they were his, while you sat in the back invisible. You mentioned it afterward to her. She said, "Don't be so sensitive. We're all on the same team." That's when something shifted. You stopped defending and started documenting. At first it felt wrong. Recording meetings, saving emails, forwarding files to a private folder only you could access. It felt like betrayal. But then again, what do you call 3 years of unpaid labor? What do you call stolen credit? What do you call being used under the disguise of love? You weren't collecting evidence to hurt them. You were collecting it to remember who you were. Because somewhere along the way, they made you doubt that. They made you feel small, dependent, as if your value came only through their validation. But in those recordings, in those saved drafts, and quietly labeled folders, you saw yourself again. You heard your ideas, your voice, your worth. Then came the moment that confirmed everything. A late evening. You stayed behind at the office, And from the hallway, you heard her father speaking, his voice low but clear. If anything goes wrong, he's not family. We'll say he was just a volunteer. No contracts, no ties. The words cut like cold glass, not because they were cruel, but because they were calculated. They had planned it, all of it. You were never one of them. You were the safety net, the expendable option, the silence they could rely on. But they didn't realize you were no longer silent. You were listening, recording, remembering. And that night walking home, you didn't cry. You didn't scream. You just opened your laptop and created a folder named Exit, not just from the company, from the illusion. Because silence in the hands of someone aware is no longer weakness. It's preparation. They thought you would beg. Instead, you left with proof. They never thought you'd leave. Not because they valued you, but because they believed you'd always need them. That was their mistake. You didn't storm out. You didn't threaten lawsuits or shout in hallways or tear up anything in front of witnesses. You simply stopped participating in your own exploitation. It began with a quiet meeting, just you and a lawyer. You laid out everything. Timestamps, documents, internal memos, voice recordings. The lawyer listened, expression unreadable, then said, "This isn't a misunderstanding. It's systemic use without consent. And we can prove it." You didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. You felt tired. Like someone who had been swimming underwater for years, finally breaking the surface, gasping for truth. At the office, things continued as if nothing had changed. They still called you kid, still passed you files, still asked for one more favor, and you did it. With calm precision. Because you weren't theirs anymore. You were wrapping things up. Not out of loyalty, but out of clarity. Then came the day. You printed a letter, short formal final, attached a list of your contributions, every project, every deal, every unpaid hour, all traceable, all verifiable, all time-stamped. You handed it to her father first. He scanned the document, his eyes shifting. "What's this?" he asked. You met his gaze. "Proof," you said, "and my resignation." Her brother stood up trying to interrupt, but you raised a hand. "I won't be staying for a discussion. The lawyer will be in touch. I suggest you speak to yours." And then you walked, not flinching, not looking back. She followed you halfway to the elevator. "We could have worked this out," she whispered. But her eyes said something else. Not sorrow, not love, just fear of exposure, of consequence. You didn't answer, because she knew. They all did. They had counted on your silence, and now that silence had become their undoing. Later that week, a client reached out not to them, but to you. "We always knew you were the real mind behind that project. Let us know if you're open to something independent." That was the moment it all changed. Not because you hurt them, but because you stopped letting them hurt you. You didn't just leave the company. You left the pattern. You left the role they wrote for you. And what you carried out that day wasn't revenge. It was your name. It was your truth. And that was more powerful than anything they had stolen. You weren't a pawn. You were the player who learned to stand. You didn't tell this story out of anger. You told it because someone somewhere is standing in your old shoes right now, smiling through unpaid work, swallowing words in boardrooms, calling it love when it's really leverage, calling it loyalty when it's really fear. And maybe that someone is you. So listen closely. You weren't weak for trusting them. You weren't foolish for loving her. You weren't naive for believing that effort would be enough. That's what good people do. They give. They show up. They commit. But here's what they don't always do. They don't always know when it's time to stop giving to people who only know how to take. Your story isn't about revenge. It's about realization. That love without respect is control. That trust without protection is submission. That work without recognition is theft dressed in gratitude. And walking away, that wasn't weakness. That was you, finally standing where you belong, outside the cage you mistook for a home. You didn't burn their house down. You simply stopped holding up the roof And once you left, they had to face what they'd built without your hands to steady it. Maybe they learned something. Maybe they didn't. But you did. You learned that silence can be sacred, but only when it serves truth, not when it hides it. You learned that no title, boyfriend, son-in-law, partner means anything when it's not backed by respect. You learned that kindness is not a debt, and sacrifice should never be expected. It should be honored. Now you build again, not with bitterness but with boundaries, not with promises but with principles, not to prove yourself, but to protect yourself. And if someone is listening now, someone still stuck, still hoping, still giving, you speak not as a victim, not as a hero, but as someone who finally looked in the mirror and whispered, "Not like this, not anymore." So tell your story, even if your voice shakes, even if they call you ungrateful, even if no one claps at the end, because sometimes survival is the quietest kind of triumph. And truth is the only closure you'll ever need.